I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. We've known each other for quite a while, and back when no one knew who either of us was, and he's just become a fantastic pollster for a whole lot of great candidates, from Glenn Youngkin to Ted Cruz. What I really like about him is he's a skeptic of the data and appreciates the data as well. And I figure there are so many conversations on my radio show, for example. We get so many calls from people now, you can't believe any poll ever. You can't believe the trends, you can't believe anything. It's like, I should get someone who really knows what they're talking about to come here and talk to us about how do you navigate this wild time with statistics and surveys and polling and focus groups. What do you look for? What do you know? How does it work? So please welcome my friend Chris Wilson. Thank you very much.
Thanks, man.
So I guess my first question for you is, how do you look at polling that comes out of the nation? Do you look at the trends, if everything's going in the same direction? Do you look at the numbers? What do you do?
Well, there's so much wrapped up in that, and it's difficult because I try and practice the strategy in life that I never say anything bad about anybody. But there is some bad polling out there. And it is, whenever data comes out, I tend to look at what is aggregated. And I'll look at either 538's aggregation or Real Clear Politics' aggregation or Pollster.com's aggregation. But not to sound like I have delusions of grandeur, I'm going to put mine above all of the other ones. And you talked yesterday to Governor Stitt, and that was a really fun campaign. Because Governor Stitt, when he was running for re-election in 2022, there was a lot of public polling. In fact, you and I talked about it, I think, on your show, or may have just been hanging out and grabbing dinner together. But there was polling that had it everywhere from at best a dead heat to at worst him down 5 points. And this was everything. So if you looked at the aggregate public data, it showed him down. And we had numbers internally that had us up 15 points. 14.7 to be exact. And we were so frustrated about it because it's getting covered. And the trick on the Democrat side is they are so good with their Act Blue network at raising money that it becomes a self-perpetuating prophecy. And I'm going through this year with Ted Cruz. And they put out numbers that shows the race closer than it is. And it usually starts with some sort of obscure third-party pollster that's paid for by the Democratic Party, and then there becomes a herding mentality with a lot of the different public polling firms and say, well, you had this Democrat poll came out and it shows it within 3 points, so I know we have it down, we have Cruz up 10, but why don't we weight up college-educated suburbanites, or why don't we weight up African Americans and look at them at a different level? In Texas, it's actually they weight up Democrats and independents, or they make independents more liberal than they actually are. And so we spent our own money because we didn't want to release the governor's numbers directly, and put out a poll that had it at 14.7%. And I think the governor mentioned yesterday he won by more than he did last time. It was 15 points. And everybody in the crowd's like, wow, that was great. He came up to me, did you see I beat your numbers by 0.3? You were off. And I'm like, oh, thanks, Governor. Appreciate that. But it is. So what we look for from a standpoint, let me talk about how we do it internally rather than bash anybody else, because I think it's important. And it's why polling has, I first got started, Eric, and you talked about whenever you and I first met, it was back in the 90s. And doing a poll in a congressional race was $7,000, $8,000. And that was, you didn't have to call everybody on their cell phone. We just called you all up during dinner, which everybody likes so much. They'd answer it up, we'd ask questions, and they'd go back to eating. And now you've got to call 50, 60, 70% of people on cell phones, and it's made that price of $75,000, $80,000 has gone. Your typical congressional district survey is $30,000, $40,000. But that's if it's done right. Now you'll have a public poll done by a media organization that is just going to be all IVR, which is integrated voice recognition, so it's a robo poll that's done to landlines. It's actually illegal to do those to cell phones. And they will go put those numbers out as if they're somewhat reflective. Whenever it doesn't talk to a single person on a cell phone, they may supplement it with some texting. And the way that we do it is we will actually build, and we're more of a data science company now than we are a polling company. We actually do more analytics than we do survey research. And we'll build a propensity model on someone's likelihood to vote. And so we'll look at those based on the turnout of the year of what is the propensity above about a 0.5. So you think about an X and a Y axis, you got 0.5 is really above where someone is likelihood to vote, and that's who's going to make it into our interview. Now, if you don't have the money to afford that propensity model, then your polling's wrong from the beginning. And that's what, for any of you who follow polling as obsessively and as unfortunately as I do, you saw a bunch of numbers come out this morning from New York Times that has Harris up now in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Now, I'll just go through those as an example. And again, I'm not going to disparage them. I won't even talk about the internals, but I'll just talk about the history to 2020. So in Michigan, it had Trump at 46, Harris at 50. So that's a 4-point difference. The last polling that they had in 2020 had Biden up by 8. He won by 2.8. In Pennsylvania, there's a trend here. It's a little bit interesting. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on it. 46-50, Harris up. In 20, they had Biden up 6. He won by 1.2. And then Wisconsin, now I'm not talking the New York Times. There's been some other famous polls, like the ABC poll actually had Biden up by 18 going into the election in 2020. But the one that just came out, 46-50, again, exact same numbers. In 2020, they had Biden up 11. He won by 0.07. So now you have to look at that. Is that a crime of commission or maybe a crime of omission? And I'd like to believe that it is a crime of omission in that they don't have the ability, because they don't have analytics behind it, to predict the likelihood of someone to turn out and do something, in this case to vote. And that is, so whenever I look at polling, and I actually make some notes on this because I had the benefit of you sending me the questions beforehand. So what do you look for in terms of an accurate survey? And I've got a obsessive compulsive nature of trying to create mnemonic ways, of remembering things. And some wild tigers make history. So the S, sample size, selection. That's what I talk about, the data analytics. How many interviews are there? But really the selection is what's important. And then wild, W, weighting and adjustment. Do they put in there that they are weighting the numbers based on something? Do they look at a certain stat like how people voted in 2020 or how they voted in 16 and adjust for that? Tigers, T, transparency of data. Are they releasing their crosstabs? It's amazing how many times a survey will come out and they will not release what's behind it. This happens in Texas all the time, where we do a lot of work there statewide. And they won't tell us how many interviews came hypothetically from El Paso versus Midland, or East Texas versus South Texas. And that being the case, you have no idea. The entire survey could have been done in Tarrant County or Dallas County or Harris County. And so I'd say transparency matters a lot. Make the mode of data. Is it by telephone? Is it by IVR? Is it by web? Is it by panel? What is the mode in which they're collecting it? And then history. The H, historical accuracy. What is the historical accuracy of the firm? I just gave you numbers looking back at 2020 and with that New York Times poll, how far it was off in those states. And so should we assume that 4 years later, that they've corrected the challenges they had that put them off in many of those cases by more than 5 points in 2020? And I would argue probably not, though you ought to be a little bit skeptical of those numbers.
So you mentioned that, and so the New York Times Siena poll in 2022 is pretty good, but when I was running political campaigns, I would tell candidates, well, you got to figure out your turnout for your race. Right. You can't look at that place 2 years ago because you weren't on the ballot. You got to go, if you're running for school superintendent, you got to go 4 years before for school superintendent as opposed to 2 years before for the Board of Elections, right, or Board of Education, because a presidential race has different turnout from an off-year election. Your districts matter. So when you look at things like that, do you look, for example, the Siena poll, pretty good in 2022 at the end, and the numbers caught some trends, but in 2020, not good with the presidential election. So when you look at pollsters generally, should you say, it's a presidential year? How did they do the last presidential year?
Absolutely. And the key behind that and what you're getting at is the enthusiasm. Because in an off-year election, whenever you do a political poll, I'm less concerned about what it says right now. I'm more concerned about how I can impact it on behalf of my candidates. So the Stitt thing I was talking about earlier is the reason why others were so wrong is because they were looking at turnout from 2018, to the point that Eric's making. And what happened in 2018? Well, that was the Trump midterm. Republicans lost the House. It was not a good year for Republicans. So if you're building a sample based on that, then you're going to just assume that 2018 is going to repeat itself. Well, what we do on the political side of things, sorry about that, is we look at where we can make adjustments. So the idea is not to look at just those people who are currently voting, but who could we motivate to vote? And that's what's really going to be so fascinating, I think, about 2024. And it's why you have seen a bounce, I would consider it to be a sugar high, but we'll see whether I'm right or not, in Harris's numbers going up. Because there was a Democrat lack of enthusiasm with Biden at the top of the ticket. So we've seen that enthusiasm come up. And in fact, I was looking at, as of this morning, Kamala Harris's fave-unfave, overall, her net favorability has moved 9 points. Now, there's no reason for that other than the way the media has defined her. It's funny how they all got the same memo. I'm calling it a campaign of joy. It's like this year's Hope and Change, right? But so that definition has allowed, and her reintroduction has created a Democrat bump in enthusiasm. 24 will be a bit of a unique presidential year in that I do believe both campaigns have the ability to motivate enthusiasm and affect turnout. Typically in a presidential year, that's not the case. Now, the point you were making a little bit ago, in an off year, you do have the ability to affect enthusiasm, to affect turnout, and that's why you look at Stitt's numbers, and it was different. Brian Kemp, same thing. I'll tell you, we did the same. We worked for Kemp in 2018 when he beat Stacey Abrams, and a lot of that public polling, as you remember, we talked about this, I think, on your show too. It's like I'm always on there making predictions. Fortunately, they've most part been right. I've had lots of other shows where I've been wrong, and I don't get asked at their conferences. But it is, Abrams was up in all those polls, and I remember going on your show, and same thing with Perdue when we did his stuff a few years before that, when he won that primary and that runoff, where we had them up. And it is just a simple matter of, the polling may have been right at the time that showed Abrams up, but we knew those people that needed motivation to turn out and vote. And by those were the ones that we targeted, that's who we spent the money on, that's who we were able to contact, and that is really the value of political polling. And it's why you're very seldom, if you went and looked at a public polling website and tried to look for our numbers, you wouldn't find many. Because outside of the stuff that we'll do on our own and just go release because I get irritated on behalf of a friend like Governor Stitt and pay for that ourselves, that was our personal polling, we don't release much because we're not looking at it to predict what's going to happen. We're looking at it to affect what's going to happen. And political polling is very different than public polling. And that's why whenever you talk about when you used to run campaigns, your advice was well placed in trying to get people to adjust what they were doing, because there's a lot of political pollsters that don't do that. They still believe their job is just to predict the future, and I don't think that's a valuable use of our science.
It struck me back it was in the 90s, and it was Dick Morris. Clinton hired him, and Morris told Clinton that polling is inductive, not deductive, and you're using it not to figure out what's popular to do, but to how to make what you want to do popular, how to talk about it in a certain direction, and how to build your campaign. And it's one of the things I actually love about what you guys do, is you're mentioning is like, people can release public polling and say, yeah, my guy's ahead. But what you never see is the in-depth, super thick binder of polling crosstabs that the campaign is using to what message is working, what isn't, where are we pulsing, where are we not, who do we need to get. And I don't think people understand that layer of polling.
Yeah, and that's the value of it. And I say polling is really, the purpose of it today is to answer a lot of big questions. And the one that you said, we use a methodology called message mapping, in which we do a regression analysis that determines what messages motivate behavior the best, but that's still at a mass level. And you don't win campaigns anymore at a mass level. In fact, one of the successful things, and there weren't many of them, and as Eric knows, I've actually moved to Atlanta to work for the Ron DeSantis Super PAC, and which is, I often describe as a little bit of like if someone had moved to Little Bighorn to fight for Custer. It's kind of had the same effect. But in the spring, and I just read Meredith McGraw's new book, Trump in Exile, which I think just came out on Tuesday. I read right through it because it was, I don't know, like therapy for me or something. But it talked about, the Trump campaign coming and trying to kill DeSantis early on. And we certainly saw that coming in the spring of 23. And so we were trying to keep our head above water, and we did a testing to determine what had the greatest degree of impact for moving voters. And there's a guy named Sasha Eisenberg, who's kind of known as a data journalist, who wrote a great book about the Obama 2008 analytics effort called the Victory Lab. And if you haven't read, I highly recommend it, even though it's now, almost 20 years old, it's still a great book, kind of a seminal text that led to the evolution of our career and kind of it taking off for our industry. But we were able to understand those people who would consider voting for Governor DeSantis, and then what messages motivated them. Now, you can't do that with polling at the individual level. That's done with analytics. And I think there are so many times now where campaigns are utilizing polling because they have someone around who doesn't really understand that analytics is better for motivating at the individual level. And you don't have to used to be, to do this was prohibitively expensive. But you don't have to run a multi-million-dollar campaign anymore. You can do it for a school board race. In fact, we just did a bunch of it for a national group that helps select conservative school board members, and won almost all of those races. I think we were like 70-1 or something like that. So I bring that up to say is these are techniques now that used to be only available to the big campaigns that, the super consultants like Eric Erickson used to run, whereas now you can really do it all the way down to the local level. And I highly recommend for any of you that get involved in politics and work with it that you let the people you are helping know that this is no longer just something that's done at the presidential level because of things like Moore's Law and the evolution of computing power and artificial intelligence and data analytics and open source software like R and Python that you can use for no cost. This is really not difficult or expensive to do. It may be complex and complicated, but having said that, the ability to target people at the individual level, and so back to that DeSantis study, what was fascinating about that, Eric, is what's always recommended in major campaigns. Usually TV, second mail. Well, in our testing, and there's an article about this in Politico you could go read by Eisenberg, we measured broadcast TV certainly was most effective. But analytics then showed us the second most effective way to deliver a message and persuade a voter was a video sent by text message, which is like 8 to 10 cents per voter. Now, the challenge of that, and not to cast aspersions on my industry, but I'll do it anyway, is there's not a lot of profit in that. And so you don't see that done as much as it should be. You know what was least effective in terms of motivating voters or moving numbers?
Please don't say radio.
No, that was right at the top. Of course, right at the top. Direct mail. Direct mail, which is
highly lucrative.
Highly lucrative. Highly lucrative.
Wow.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a challenge for us in winning some of these tough races is because sometimes decisions that are made for campaigns are maybe not done in the best interest of the campaign spending.
You say that, and just as a random aside, I remember the very first congressional race I ran, and I did it by accident in large part because I was the guy's lawyer, and the campaign manager was very passive-aggressive and disappeared, just walked away from the campaign. And I was stunned to understand how, the commissions on mail and placing ads work. And as a lawyer, under the ethics rules that I was in Georgia, I wasn't allowed to do that. And so my candidate wound up being able to place mail and TV cheaper because I couldn't take a commission off the top. And I was like, wow, this is why all these guys in campaigns get so fabulously wealthy doing stuff like this. And now, as long as it's gone on, it makes so much sense to me is why I get so many mail pieces that I never read, and yet I get them in the mailbox.
Yeah, where do you open them? Where do you open your
right
mail?
over the trash.
Exactly. Yeah. So does everybody else.
Yes.
Yeah.
So can you just educate the people real quick, because I don't know that people realize with mobile phones, the rules are different from calling landline phones for polling. Yeah,
they are. It is. Like I said, you can do cheap polling to a home phone because you can use those robopolls. Just press 1 if you're voting for Kamala Harris and press 2 for Donald Trump. But you can't do that to a cell phone. You can, but you can get prosecuted for it. It's happened to several people in our industry, or you can get sued, which is even worse. And so you do have to call with a live caller. And that's what I was talking about earlier about the increase in the cost of polling has been driven by that. Now, and the same is true with analytics. Now, with analytics, whenever we do, you figure a survey, I mentioned earlier sample size. I always remember the Some Wild Tigers Make History, that's the S. Sample size. You can do a national poll with 1,000 interviews and get a 3.2% margin of error. Margin of error is a simple statistical calculation. It's just 0.9604 divided by the sample size, and you take the square root of that. In terms of building out the analytics, you really have to collect 1,000 to 3,000 observations to be able to do it. And so there's a lot of interviews that have to go into that to be able to do it. I think I'm putting people to sleep.
No. So now
but that's got to be done with live. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. That's okay. I wonder what that was. So from sample size and that, I wanted to talk about the online polling because there's where my deep skepticism in polling lies. that
There's a lot of public polls that are done online.
yeah, there are so many, and I tend to be dismissive of the online polls in large part because just knowing who has computers and who's regularly engaged in computers, it seems like you're really skewing your sample of people towards people who have access to computers, want to engage, and they tend to probably not be a broader demographic.
Yeah, and then those that are willing to participate in a poll for some sort of reward, be it sort of like frequent flyer mileage, points on a supermarket, loyalty program. There is always some sort of payoff for doing that. Now, I'm not implying there's something wrong with that. I'm just saying it does create a different type of respondent because you probably would not participate for a supermarket loyalty point. And so because of that, I do think the other aspect of it that I always look at when I look at public polling, you got sample representation, you have margin of error, you have the question wording, I dig into that, you have the pollster's track record, I kind of mentioned that with history, but then there's the timing. How long is something in the field? And I'm always, this year because of Ted Cruz being up, I'm always fixated on what's going on with the Texas polling because there's a ton of it released. And the University of Texas puts out these polls on a regular basis that'll be in the field for like 2 weeks.
Right.
And if we have 2 days to do a poll, we're excited about it. Usually our clients are wanting us in and out in one night. And the reason for that is not because they're impatient, they are, but that's still not the reason. The reason is because things change. Can you imagine if you were in the field while Joe Biden announced he was dropping out and you're doing a presidential survey? Well, it kind of becomes irrelevant. You have to start over. And so if you're in the field for 2 weeks, imagine the evolution of public opinion that can occur in that time. And so those panels require a much longer amount of time for being in the field. And so if there's a reason why I'm skeptical of them, yes, there's a little bit of sampling on it, but it's the timing and the length of time it takes to be able to collect a large sample survey so you've got a lot of them that are in that category. I mean, Motor and Consult's probably the most famous one, but you've got YouGov as a panel. You've got Ipsos, a lot of theirs is done by panels. Some are not, some are still phones, but there's a lot of major surveys that are reported as reliable data that are online, and I agree with you.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of them. And I remember when I first got started, I would have campaign strategists tell me, don't take weekend pollings because it tends to be biased against people who might be going to church, or polling that's done on just a Wednesday because all the Baptists are in a prayer meeting on Wednesday night. And I don't know how that holds up over time. I think with people less and less going to church, maybe it doesn't, but I've always been skeptical of polling that's taken over the weekend.
Yeah, I think that's probably changed a lot due to the cell phone. The ability to contact people on cell phones. We don't really, I'm less likely to be concerned about a survey done at a certain time period because we are so meticulous about the stratifications and who's going to feed into it. And there are some exceptions to that, like I wouldn't do a survey in Utah on family night. That's a big deal. They don't answer the phone at all. And you may remember, I think one of the first times I made it on the national scene did Mike Lee's race against an incumbent United States Senator, and I learned a lot about polling in Utah during that. That was an interesting experience, and now we have done just pretty much every race in Utah since. And so from that standpoint, there are exceptions, but for the most part, because of cell phones, you can pretty much call whatever. And you also have the ability to, if you call, you can text and say, hey, try to call you, I'm trying to do a survey, is there a time I can reach you back? And so we'll do that to try and make sure we're able to keep our sample right. But a really famous example going back to the panel thing, the USC poll, and it's kind of gone away because remember 2016, they had this sample that had, I think, like 4 African Americans in it. And they were waiting up. They said, oh, we got this new special, super secret way of doing things. And it finally came out that because Trump was winning African Americans in the survey, well, because of the 4, 2 of them were Trump supporters. And they finally the survey just kind of went away because of that. And it was a kind of a famous story and also a pretty big warning.
So let me move again to focus groups a little bit because I see the media. I mean, Frank Luntz famously known for doing focus groups, panel discussions, things like that. But I see more and more people do that. Obviously, they're different, but can campaigns glean useful information from sitting down with like 15 randomly selected people as opposed to doing a survey of 1,000 people?
They have different uses. That's the bottom line. And I prefer doing focus groups now online because I think you can bring people in from a lot of different locations. You're not limited to a facility in North Cobb County, which is kind of the famous one that we use here all the time for our Georgia stuff. And you can also kind of be more agile online. It's kind of tough if you want to all of a sudden decide you want to test an ad to bring in if you didn't already have a machine set up to show one in a focus group facility. Having said that, the usage of a focus group is primarily to get at sort of a why people feel a certain way. A survey is going to tell you what they feel, but it's not going to answer the why questions. Sometimes they're like, there are issues, and I could see really focus groups would be very valuable to try and understand shifting attitudes toward Kamala Harris. There is a large percentage of certain segments of the population that either weren't going to vote or weren't going to vote at all or weren't going to vote for Biden that have now been motivated by her. If we come to the conclusion that they are now definitely going to vote, well, it's important to find out why that is. What changed their opinion? And maybe they don't change their mind in the presidential race, but that matters to me in Texas for a Ted Cruz reelect, for instance. What is it that changed your mind? Okay, now looking down ballot, what is it that would cause you to split your ticket as you move down the ballot? Or a Dave McCormick race, who was here earlier. I think that's going to be important to him because Pennsylvania is going to be it's going to be a very competitive race at the presidential level, and so he's got to worry about that a little bit as new people have entered into it. So I'd say that's the value of focus groups, is to really get at an understanding of what it is that changes opinions, motivates opinions, causes opinions, but it doesn't really tell you how to influence those opinions. And it certainly isn't one where if someone comes out of a focus group and says, okay, we've determined that people feel X, well, then it should be absolutely dismissed out of hand. It is not. It's directional at best.
I've been interested in this rise you see, particularly on the left now, in the groups that hate Donald Trump. They come out with their focus groups on. They're always baffled by why black men might, for example, want to support Donald Trump, and it's almost like, we joke about the conservatives and the mistake of the New York Times and stuff and now we're finding it more, for example, with black men who may not toe the Democratic line and the media just can't quite understand. Can you talk a little bit about the demographic shifts you see in Hispanics and black voters, particularly like I remember this massive wave that DeSantis had in Florida the last time with such big increases in the non-white voter. Here in Georgia, Brian Kemp's seen an uptick in the Hispanic vote.
He has, and I would say the Hispanics are the best representation of an evolution of a political class from amongst a demographic group that I've seen in a long time. Because whereas, again, I've been doing Ted Cruz stuff since 2012, Greg Abbott in 2014. I mean, the amount of data we've collected in the state of Texas. In fact, I'll creep you guys out for a second. We have over 200,000 predictive models built on every single one of the 16.5 million registered voters in the state of Texas. Our ability to predict their behavior is pretty acute. And so from that, we have now seen South Texas really shift from being a Democrat stronghold to a Republican stronghold. And it's been a fascinating thing to watch from sort of a sociological perspective. And it is, look, there's a lot of reasons that go into it. You can't ever point to one thing and say it's because of Donald Trump and his approach to governing. But that's certainly been an impact. I think a lot of it has been the immigration issue. There are, right now, if you believe that only legal citizens are voting, then they are not happy about illegals coming into the border. And that certainly has changed the face of South Texas and made it one where Republicans in the state legislature and even all the way up to the congressional level has flipped many of those seats in South Texas. Florida's a little bit different because it's a Cuban population rather than a Mexican population. And so we've seen, they've understood the difficulties and the problems with communism and socialism for a long time. And so we have not seen those same trends occur in New Mexico and Arizona, but it seems to be one that is slowly happening. I do believe that prior to Harris becoming the nominee, New Mexico did look like it was on the map as a competitive state. It may come back to being a competitive state, and that was primarily due to Hispanics there. Arizona, again, Trump had a pretty decent lead in Arizona, still does. The most recent polling I saw still has him up 2 points there. Does that mean that Kari Lake can be competitive in a Senate race? I don't know at this point. She's down. Last polling I saw publicly was double digits. I think that's probably off by 3 or 4 points, but it's certainly still a lead for the Democrat there. Lego. And then California, California's just a complete mess. But Nevada's where I was wanting to go. Nevada's another one where I worked for Adam Laxalt in 22, and we had a decent lead with Hispanics up until the end. I could talk about Nevada forever in terms of what happened there. I remember having a conversation with Adam the Saturday before the election saying that because he had such a significant lead that, wow, they'd really have to take ballot boxes into casinos and have union voters vote there to lose. Guess what? That's exactly what they did. It's like they actually took them to right into the casinos and didn't stuff them, and they legally stuffed them. So, but all of those places are ones where we have seen the Hispanic population change from being overwhelmingly Democrat. I mean, Cruz's first race for Senate in 12, he only lost them by like 15 points. I mean, this year he should win them by 10 to 12 points. Abbott's won them. He won them in 28. He won, 20. He won them in 18, 22. And so in the DeSantis won them by over 20 points last time. And so I think that is a situation where there's so many things that have fed into it that you really can't point to one specific matter. But certainly the flood of immigration has caused Hispanics to, they were already kind of teetering a little bit because of the family value issues and recognizing the Republican Party being a better representation of their values. And now I think immigration has kind of pushed them over the edge. And there is certainly an attraction to Donald Trump with Hispanic voters. I can't argue that, despite the fact that, look, I worked against him for Ted Cruz in 2016 and Ron DeSantis in 2024. So it's nobody's ever probably ran more races against him than I have. But I've watched it with admiration.
Listen, I appreciate you hanging out with me. This has been fascinating. I always love picking your brain on this stuff because I love finding out about it. So thank you.
You know, Eric, it was really exciting. I was telling my wife after you invited me to come here, I'm like, oh, this is awesome. I'm going to be on the same stage at Chip Roy and Mike Pence and Kevin Stitt and Ron DeSantis are on. She goes, wow, that's great. You're the only one I've never heard of. So thanks for letting me be the one you never heard of.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks, man. That was great.
Thank you.
That was really great. Yeah.